Uh, okay, start it.
All right, thanks, Tao,
Take it
and
away.
thank you. Welcome back, everybody. And for those that are new to our book club, thanks for joining. We're glad you're here. Same kind of housekeeping items as last week that, we're recording the sessions. So if you don't want to be, recorded, keep your questions to yourself. But we'd love to have this as interactive as possible. So interrupt along the way, speak up, chime in. There's mostly Morningstar thought leaders on the phone, but there's outside industry gurus as well. I'd say try to stay muted if you're not talking, but when you have your question, remember to take yourself off mute. If you have a technical issue, Spencer and Tao, their emails are there. Please give them an email, send them an email, and then from a compliance perspective, this is not advice, although I guess it's advice on how to give advice. So not sure, feel like that's an odd item. If I can get my slides to go, let's see. I guess in terms of where we are, the book is laid out into 3 parts. We're in the middle of part 1. We're about halfway through chapter 2 on a holistic investor profile. And I will get going. I think this is the last slide that we covered during session 1, where we've introduced a hypothetical investor, Isabella. We've kind of gone through different ways in which we would get at some of the pecuniary or financial preferences that go beyond risk tolerance for Isabella. And I believe Steve Horan has asked, what are appropriate ranges for these values, a little bit about how do you measure it. And again, as we move maybe later into the session, but even sessions down the way, we'll kind of get into, as we apply and build out the models, what are appropriate values for somebody's preferences that would feed into the life cycle model that we'll be discussing. Last week, we discussed, I'd say, everything over here on the left. This is all somebody's kind of pecuniary investor profile, and this is where I'm going to pick it up. Is off to the right, we have non-pecuniary or non-financial preferences that people might have. Again, we think that should just be part of an overall investor profile. These could be faith-based beliefs. These could just be values that one has, but we can incorporate those into the personalization of the advices ultimately coming out of the model. In terms of how might somebody measure those non-pecuniary preferences, again, I think that as an industry, we're in our infancy as to how we might measure that. I've been a proponent for kind of having a broad oriented question that tries to frame it as a trade-off, perhaps as a customization fee, or perhaps a drain on return for if you're going to limit your opportunity set of investments to those things that reflect your values, or you're going to attempt to significantly underweight items that you dislike. What sort of trade-off are you willing to give? And so this is a hypothetical question on trying to calibrate that trade-off for a given investor. In chapter 2, as people may have read, we can move on to the kind of this analysis, which is here on the left and the right, or there's hypothetical slider bars where they'd start off in a neutral position where 2 things that people probably like or probably dislike are pitted against each other. The triangles representing the kind of the sliders would be in a neutral position off in the middle. And then in terms of learning about somebody's preference, you'd ask them to kind of move these sliders. And my belief is generally people don't like to spend much time on a risk tolerance questionnaire. And unfortunately, when it gets to their preferences, they probably have preferences, but again, they're probably not willing to spend too much time. And I think this type of method, and of course there could be other methods, in which one is able to explain or elaborate on kind of what is the relative importance of their preferences, and that can be incorporated into personalized advice. In another part of kind of chapter 2, an item that Paul and I discuss is just that advisors and wealth managers really need a coherent overall planning system. I think it's very common that an advisor would have a large number of different applications that they're using from different providers using different methodologies. And it is not at all clear to me that those different pieces speak to each other in a good, coherent way to provide coherent advice. And something that we're just kind of learning about is that, there's kind of built-in assumptions to almost every piece software system that somebody is using. And it's, again, unclear whether or not they're speaking the same language, calibrating things the same, even mean the same thing for various items. An item that Paul and I kind of dig into a little bit kind of near the end of chapter 2 is different interpretations of risk tolerance. And so kind of in this column, you have interpretation A, which is this, independent view of risk preference, risk tolerance. And on the right, you can see it's kind of an expanded definition where it could be influenced by a number of factors. I would say over the years, thinking of kind of the limitations of a risk tolerance questionnaire and prior to the creation of the overall framework that Paul and I have created here with the life cycle model feeding into the net worth optimization that we discussed, and I'll be expanding and will be expanding upon it as we move forward. I probably would have been in the camp that advisors need to think about I would have always been in the camp that they need to think about their clients holistically. And I would have argued that in addition to taking that risk tolerance questionnaire, that advisor needed to use the risk tolerance questionnaire essentially as a basis for asking and learning more about their clients, and then attempting to factor that into the ultimate recommendation. And so it's kind of blurry on the right side over here in terms of interpretation B, informed attitudes. In a perfect world, and I think Paul and I have come close to laying out, at least from a modeling perspective, a comprehensive framework that is capturing a variety of different preferences of the investor and a holistic view of the investor situation. We want to move back, I think, to a true independent view of what is somebody's risk tolerance, where it's not being influenced by necessarily their current situation. It's really true to what is their attitude towards risk, and that factors in as ultimately influencing their portfolio. And then in this kind of next series of slides, and I'll get there, I guess, in a second, we, again, have already introduced the idea of a holistic investor balance sheet. This is just another view of what a holistic balance sheet looks like. So again, on the left side, labeled assets, those are your primary assets or your financial assets and your human capital. Then on the right side, you have your liabilities. And then the difference between, assets minus liabilities is net worth. And then there's a series of questions off to the left, which is really what is this kind of scope of application of risk tolerance? So if somebody has taken a risk tolerance questionnaire or profiling system, what level is that applied at? And what Paul and I have basically been arguing is that at the risk tolerance should really apply to one's overall balance sheet, to their net worth, and be applied to this balance sheet, this economic balance sheet, which represents the person's overall financial health. And you can see with these kind of different call out color squares over here, One might just apply it to the brokerage account, maybe just the financial assets, perhaps all assets. But again, in the big picture, we want it applied to the big picture of the overall balance sheet. And then near the end of chapter 2, and we're almost about to wrap up, we just provide a series of examples in which we apply risk tolerance to, in this example, first of all, we're just applying it to the brokerage account, where I think we are targeting, based on the risk tolerance of the investor, a 35% equity-oriented level. And by doing that, of course, in the brokerage account, we can exactly get to 35% equities. And then from different lenses, their allocation between equities and bonds can be quite different. And at the total worth level, maybe they're not off that by that much, but they're certainly not hitting their precise target. And then in the chapter, we apply it to then a more expanded definition of financial assets, a brokerage account and retirement assets. Collectively, these are both set at 35%. Again, this is arguably ignoring asset location. And again, the net worth is not allocated appropriately given the investor's risk tolerance level of 35%. Then we get a bit closer when we apply it to all of this, where we're kind of thinking this, and of course, human capital can't really be altered, a bit off. And so in the final example, we've applied, in light of human capital, in light of the liabilities, we've applied the person's risk tolerance to their overall balance sheet, and we arrive at a net worth that has exactly 35% invested in stocks, corresponding to the person's risk tolerance level or coefficient of 35%. Paul and I still need to actually finish this up, but in the chapter, we provide a sample spreadsheet where one could put in a handful of values and be able to kind of calculate that economic balance sheet. And so in the coming days or weeks, we'll get this posted to the CFA Research Foundation website as supplementary materials. And for all of you in the book club, as soon as I'm ready, I'll just push out the Excel file to all of you. And we somewhat conclude, I would say, chapter 2, with the introduction of Isabella, a hypothetical investor who at this point in time is 25 years old. She's a marine biologist. She's earning $75,000 per year after tax. There's a little bit of information here on her retirement plan. Something that's unusual about Isabella is that she's inherited, $250,000. Her grandmother passed away and left her a home, her siblings a home, and they sold that. And this is what Isabella has left over. This $250,000 that Isabella inherited serves as motivation for her reaching out to her planner, Paula. And throughout the book, Isabella will be working with Paula, and Paula is, in theory, using a state-of-the-art new software system that is based on all of the models that we've described in this book. And so pretty soon we're going to get into the weeds, into some of the modeling and trying to create, let's say, the baseline knowledge for trying to understand life cycle finance. Again, I'm operating from the perspective that most of us on the call, while we've heard of life cycle finance, we're not experts in life cycle finance. And there's a reason that life cycle models have been perhaps not embraced, which is they're not well understood. But many people don't even know they exist. But again, they're not well understood and they're pretty complicated. And a goal that Paul and I have is for those of you that are gurus that aspire to be kind of at the forefront of what are the best methodologies for applying financial planning. Can we really explain life cycle finance and how the models work in a way that helps develop out your intuition So there'll be, of course, lots of math and lots of formulas, and I don't want that to scare you away, because Isabella will be going through this journey with her financial advisor. And for somebody that is not really wanting to implement these models, of course, on their own, I think, and just have a general understanding of it, you'll be able to see how somebody like Isabella or any other investor that, for that matter, would be able to meet with a financial planner, financial advisor who is using such a system. And you can see how the type of advice that Paula would ultimately be able to provide for Isabella. And so,
Tom?
Yes.
Tom, before we move on, Ken posted a question in the chat. Maybe you can address.
Address it. Hi, Tom. Hey, Ken, thanks for joining. Do you happen to know how regulators think about human capital and its implication on portfolio allocations? I don't really, and maybe others on the phone do. And if you do, please chime in. My belief is that regulators really aren't thinking much about human capital. And I actually worry that at some level, regulators are thinking about the problem, myopically, and in every kind of jurisdiction, so the United States is one, but there's many others, and regulators, I think, of course, have, good intentions. And I think an unintended consequence, let's say, of risk tolerance questionnaires, knowing your client, in some jurisdictions with some regulations, is the idea that, hey, my person just took the risk tolerance questionnaire, and now I need, unfortunately, to ignore their holistic perspective. Perhaps they have another account that's in all equities or all bonds, or somebody has very bond-like human capital, or maybe they have, more risky human capital. I don't know. But a concern I have is that, generally speaking, regulators aren't truly thinking about human capital, and in some instances could actually be ignoring human capital and a holistic approach to the detriment of investors. And so, Ken, you can take yourself off mute too if I didn't answer your question, and maybe others have follow-up questions. Again, we're just happy to take questions along the way. I probably should have, we're going to end on time at the top of the hour, kind of no matter what. And we're going to only get as far as we get. And really, how far we get depends on how many questions and sidebars we end up having.
Tom, thank you for that, and thank you for having me on. I'm enjoying these just thinking through these aspects of financial planning. Yeah, and I don't want to derail the conversation, but it is something as we see the incorporation of human capital. The one thing that I've always ran into with regulators is that they're pretty focused on just the risk tolerance questionnaire, and to the extent that human capital changes what the risk tolerance questionnaire might dictate, that to some extent that might expose planners to some regulatory risk to some extent. And that's a concern, because I as you said, I don't think regulators are thinking holistically about things. They tend to think pretty cookie cutter on them. But I welcome anybody's view on that as well.
All right. Well, I'll just say I totally agree, and maybe others will, have views on this. An oddity for me is that, in the retire, at least in the United States, DC 401k oriented world, the DOL has anointed 3 QDIA alternatives. So where a plan sponsor, if they select one of these qualified investment options, they have some, sort of shelter from being sued. And of course, those are target risk funds, target risk portfolios, I should say, target date funds, and managed accounts. And for a lot of times, the basis for a target date fund or a managed account is, if you could see the methodology, and often target date fund providers are not very transparent in their methodology, but to the degree that they do provide a methodology, it is not uncommon to see that the basis for becoming more conservative through time is the fact that people start off with lots of human capital, very little financial capital, and there's that trade-off. So there is some level of consistency. That the oddity, right, would be is that in the retirement world, regulators are almost embracing solutions that have inherently embraced the concept of human capital. And then in the taxable world, or the risk tolerance questionnaire dominated oriented world, it's almost the opposite of that.
Excellent point, Tom. I think that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Any other questions before we move on to?
Sorry, Tom, I would just add to that. I mean, from the regulator's perspective, the goal of the risk tolerance questionnaire is to expose conflicts of interest. So to the extent that all of this new information doesn't change any conflicts of interest, it seems like it would be fine, right? They're just trying to, all they want to do is make sure you ask if someone's a widow, and that this is all your assets before you tell them to sell everything and get pets.com. And so, right. And so once you've taken care of that, you have you're fine. As long as it's good advice, you're fine.
That does remind me of a bit of a story. So, of course, my heritage is via Ibbotson Associates, and in the lure, Ibbotson Associates had hired Dick Thaler and Danny Kahneman as outside consultants on their development of a risk tolerance questionnaire. And this predated me, so I guess I can't say it absolutely happened. But again, they consulted on the questionnaire. But for those that had met with Dick and Danny, my understanding was that Dick and Danny had always said, well, this is the risk tolerance questionnaire should serve as the basis for a conversation, to make sure you're having a conversation with your client and you really are getting to know the client. And then when I'm at conferences and I periodically meet, with financial advisors, what I often hear them say is that from a home office perspective, they've been essentially mandated to use the recommended equity level or the profile level from that risk. They file it away to kind of cover their butt. They file it away. And so this is an example of where, again, the concept of developing risk tolerance, there's a good reason to develop that. You want to apply it. You want to get to know your client. And yet somewhere along the line, right, because the home office, or in this case, in my example, is having their advisors inappropriately use a tool that should be actually should help them to get to know their client even better. And when they do get to know their client better, maybe they get to learn more about their human capital, or maybe that there's another account, it's 100% bonds, 100% equities, and that should influence how they're investing. And again, it's just an example, again, I think where as an industry, we're trying to do the right things, and sometimes we don't quite get it right.
I will add in the Photometrica methodology, that's the risk profiler that we acquired a few years ago. They break risk down into risk tolerance, how much risk is the client comfortable taking, but then required risk, how much risk would they need to take if they maximize their savings, if they delay the goal start time as long as possible, what's the required return that they would need so they don't have shortfall. And then the third one is risk capacity, which some people just say, oh, that's time horizon. Photometrica says if the worst case scenario happens, given your guaranteed sources of income, whether it's Social Security or OAS or whatever, wherever your location is, would you still be okay? Would you survive? Would you be able to withstand a bad market outcome? And I think that's a sort of a nice holistic way to think about it. But even there, risk tolerance is only one piece. If you're only doing risk tolerance, it's like, oh, client will be comfortable, and then they retire without enough money. Like, that's not the outcome that you want, right? That's just, it's comfortable now, only for a disappointment later, which is actually the thing you're trying to avoid.
Right. And that's very similar to where we're talking, and we're going to get back to the balance sheet soon. But again, last week in session one, we did dive into risk capacity as being essentially defined by your overall holistic balance sheet, which, what is your ability? You have liabilities, you have assets, how healthy is that system, which is where risk capacity is truly defined. And then in light of your risk preference, how much risk should you be taking from an overall balance sheet oriented perspective? Paul, I'm going to kind of chime it over to you, and I'll advance slides, but I think we're wrapping up kind of chapter 2, which is that call to have a holistic investor profile. And then here, as we move to chapters 3 today and next week, chapter 4, you were putting in some of the kind of necessary, I'd say, background as we work towards the actual life cycle models that we'll put forth and discuss in chapters 5 and 6. So we're in the heart of part 1 of the book now, and we're now building out baseline knowledge that is important to really understand how life cycle finance works.
Okay, Tom, let's go right into it then. The next slide. Okay, and let's just move on to the next one. Let's start getting into it a little bit. So this slide is to give really some of the background of life cycle theory. Life cycle theory is a particular application of neoclassical economics, the theory of rational behavior, and it stands at the intersection of expected utility theory, which we'll get into later, and life cycle theory that was put forth by Milton Friedman, Franco Modigliani, who were Nobel Prize winners, and then within this intersection, we have the very important work of Paul Samuelson and Robert Merton, also Nobel Prize winners, who really put this theory together, based on this foundation of theory of rational behavior. And then we're highlighting the two things we're going to focus on in the book, which is life cycle utility maximization models, and we'll explain what that means, and single period utility based portfolio theory, stemming, of course, from Markowitz and also from an article co-authored with Chaim Levy in 1979. But we'll get to all that later. Let's kind of dive into it now.
And before we dive in, I just, as a quick sidebar, this is one of my favorite exhibits of the whole book. I've never seen anything kind of like this. And, for me, where I'm coming from a background where I am not an expert in life cycle models and life cycle finance, and seeing how this really connects with the different bodies of economics, how the different types of models or theories start to relate to each other. I thought this was pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay, let's okay, so what we're just, this is just a little bit more background. What do we mean by the theory of rational decision making? And it's the assumption that a person's preferences are related to a complicated set of interdependent trade-offs can be captured by a utility function. And so a utility function is a mathematical function that basically takes as its inputs various levels of goods and services, and as we'll shortly see how it works, to assign a different level of utility or happiness to those various bundles. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Tom?
Okay, sorry. I didn't know the next one was the next one.
Okay, so we're going to get right now into an example of utility theory. And this example is actually based upon very basic microeconomics. When I was in 1978, yes, that's how long ago it was. And when I was a student at NYU, I took, in my sophomore year, I took a class called microeconomics. And in that class, the first thing we learned is the theory of the consumer, and we need just sort of we're going to need two different goods to illustrate that theory. And so one of those goods is, so we're going to make one of those. I don't remember what the two goods were in my macroeconomics textbook, but anyway, we thought it'd be kind of fun to make the two goods pizza and beer. So here's an example of diminishing marginal utility. So let's just talk about consuming pizza at the moment. So you're very hungry. You have a slice of pizza, and you get the highest increase in your level of utility or happiness. And then you eat a second slice. It's still making you happier, but you're not as happy as the first slice made you. And then same thing with the third slice. Again, you're a little bit happier, but the increase in the level of happiness is not as much as the second piece. Okay, and well, we just give a little example here that if you have 8 slices of pizza, well, you probably may not feel too good, uh, but anyway, you can think about that conceptually. What happens to have more. So we're going to talk about pizza and beer as two different goods that this consumer here in the middle of the chart likes, and this consumer has $20, and they're going to split that $20 on pizza and beer, and the price of pizza is $2 a slice, and the beer is $4 a slice. So how do you decide how much pizza and beer to consume? Well, it all depends on your preferences. So if we go to the next slide, we just have a very simple illustration here. This person comes into this party, except in this party you have to buy the food and drink. Their number one, the first level, or the rank number one of the combinations of pizza and beer is, first of all, just to have beer. And then what might they do next? Well, what they do next is and have a slice of pizza as well. And then thirdly, they might add a second slice of pizza. Fourthly, they add another glass of beer. Anyway, and so on. You can see through the numbers. The idea is that the more pizza and beer they consume, the better they feel. But the problem is that they only have $20. They face a budget constraint.
And so that's a
So
term we're going to use, I guess, real quick. Maybe people haven't heard of the budget constraint, but again, the idea of a budget constraint will be important as we develop the life cycle models.
Yeah, but before we develop, it's important in this problem too, because you only have $20, and so if you look at by the way, this chart, I had to draw charts like this by hand back in my microeconomics class, but now of course we have computers to help draw these things. So anyway, on one extreme, if you spent your $20 only on pizza, you'd have 10 slices of pizza. If you spent all your money on beer, you'd only be able to get 5 glasses. You get 5 glasses of beer. We can draw a line between those two extreme points, and that gives us all possible combinations of pizza and beer that you can get for $20. Now, what these indifference curves show you is what combinations do you feel, are you indifferent, or you have the same level of utility or happiness in these very combinations. So on the one on the green one, that one, if you don't have, and most of the point, there are 2 points along that you spend the $20, but you notice that if you went for the combinations along the green one between them, you'd have money left over. So, and we're going to assume we're not going to leave any money left over. Now, the blue one on top is called infeasible, because it's impossible to get any of those combinations with your $20. The kind of yellow orange one in the middle is the optimal combination, the optimal bundle of pizza and beer that you can get with the $20. In other words, it's the best combination given your personal preferences for pizza and beer that you can achieve for $20, given that pizza is $2 a slice and the beer is $4 a glass. So this, yeah, so this chart is really foundational to really everything else we're going to talk about in life cycle theory. Okay, so now we have another person. They also have $20, but they have a different set of preferences between pizza and beer. So we go to the next one, and we, as you can see, their combination, has more pizza and less beer than the other one did, because that's simply because they have different preferences. We've assumed the same budget constraint of $20, but this person is perhaps more hungry and less thirsty than the other person. But everyone, according to their own personal preferences, should buy those combinations of things that give them the highest level of utility or happiness. Now, we're going to now move from pizza and beer to life cycle theory. And the first thing we're going to do is our two goods are not going to be pizza and beer. Rather, they're going to be a total level of consumption in one of two time periods. So we can call those two time periods today and tomorrow, sometime into the future. And we can look at those combinations of consumption of today and tomorrow in the same way we look at pizza and beer. And that the utility functions and the curves that we're going to draw are based upon these two different parameters. So one is the subjective discount rate. How much the preference, how strong is the preference to consume now versus later? It's also sometimes called impatience. It's the idea that I would rather have something now than have to wait for it. So if you're going to, if I have to wait to the future to get something, then I better be compensated for that today. This is based fundamentally the theory of interest. This is why there are we have markets in which uh, you know uh, you can purchase securities that pay interest. This is the economic reason for it. Now the other parameter is called the EOIS, the elasticity of intertemporal substitution, and that's how much you prefer to smooth your consumption from one period to the next. If the higher this value is, the more flexible you are between moving consumption between today and tomorrow, and the lower it is, the more rigid you are in your consumption preferences. So what we've done here is we have an equation. This is a budget constraint. And this budget constraint is in term consumption this year versus consumption next year. And this budget constraint assumes we assume this letter R here denotes really a market determined rate of interest. And then W0 is how much wealth you begin with. So what you're going to decide to do, just like the people were deciding between pizza and beer, subject to a budget constraint, we're going to assume here's a consumer that's going to decide between consumption this year and consumption next year, who basically takes the price of consumption this year versus next year, is expressed as the rate of interest, and has a certain amount of wealth to do so. So we can go to the next slide. Now, again, this slide is basically the same slide as the pizza and beer slide, except it has consumption this year versus consumption next year, and there's a budget constraint. If you consume everything this year, and you have nothing left over to earn interest on, then you're going to have nothing next year. Alternatively, if you completely refrain from consumption and only invest and only consume next year, put all your money in an interest-bearing security, then of course you'll have nothing today, but you'll have everything tomorrow. No, the reality is, of course, is that we all need to have something we both this year and next year, and our attitude towards consumption this year versus next year has those two parameters. One of which is the subjective discount rate. And we're gonna take a look. Let's take a look at what are the implications of this. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so in this is a very, very simple life cycle model in which there are only two periods and there's no uncertainty. And yet this very simple model, I think, contains within it a lot of insight. So for one thing, it says is that if the subjective discount rate and the market interest rate are equal to each other, then I consume equal amounts in both periods. On the other hand, if let's suppose let's see, we have the market rate is less than the subjective discount rate, then the market rate is not enough to induce becomes not enough to induce us. Let's see. And let's see this one. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, this. Oh, that's sorry. That's
they're equal.
Yeah, that's right. Then the row equals 5 is the equal one. That's right. And then the row equals 0. I'm indifferent between consumption this year and next year. Well, if I'm indifferent between consumption this year and next year, then what I would do is I would in fact consume more in the future. But if I heavily discount the future relative to the present in the last column, then I would actually reduce have more consumption today and less in the future. And also notice in the equation above it that the degree to which the difference between the market rate and the subjective discount rate have an impact on your consumption does depend on this elasticity of substitution. So if I were to raise that number, then I'd get bigger differences between consumption today and consumption tomorrow. If I reduce that number, I get less differences. Okay. All right. The next part is we're going to talk about how in a life cycle model, how do we handle uncertainty? And the way we handle that is through a theory of it's called expected utility theory. It was developed by two mathematicians, John von Neumann and Oscar von Morgenstern. They published a book called The Theory of Games in 1944, and they solved this problem about how should we figure out and model how a rational consumer should handle uncertainty. And in this case, instead of having bundles of goods under the alternatives are not consumption today and consumption tomorrow, but they're going to be consumption in different states of the world. So maybe in one state where the market is up, and in another state where the market is down. And how do you decide, how much to consume in each state? Okay, so moving ahead, once again we have what really is again the same graph, except now it's up market versus down market instead of consumption, in the future and consumption today. And we put this dotted 45-degree line in the middle, and that represents the risk-free asset. A risk-free asset pays the same amount in all states of nature. And that's kind of an important starting point is when you think about what what we mean by these lotteries, because in general, of course, consumption is going to be different in different states. So we can move on from there. Okay, now, of course, in the real world, individuals cannot purchase lotteries that only pay in a specific state. Okay, so I can't buy a security that only, let's say, that pays $1 if it, or one example would be, you can't buy a contract that gives you an umbrella on Tuesday if it's raining. It doesn't work that way. The reality is you have to buy securities, and securities are really bundles of these lotteries. Every given security basically pays a different amount in each possible future state. And of course when we think about securities and portfolios, you'll also think in terms of dollar figures as much as we often figure rates of return, and we build models of what are the possible rates of return on different securities. And then finally, of course, Markowitz, he developed this method of ranking portfolios as combinations of expected return and standard deviation of return. And that in the Markowitz world, when we think about the utility of a portfolio for a given investor, we think about it in terms of expected return and standard deviation. And the Markowitz approach ranks, different possible portfolios according to expected return and standard deviation. Okay. Tom?
Hopefully it's made it. Next slide.
Okay. So this is the Markowitz view of the world. We have expected return and standard deviation of return as our measure of risk, expected return versus risk. And we also have a budget constraint, but now the budget constraint is called the efficient frontier. What are the best possible combinations of expected return and standard deviation that are possible? And that's what, of course, we use a Markowitz optimizer to figure out that curve, or here it's shown as a line, could be. And then basically, but then there also are indifference curves that we can draw just as well. Now, previously, we drew all our indifference curves were all negatively sloped because what was represented on both axes were goods. But in a mean variance world, we have one good, expected return, and one bad, which is standard deviation. And so here we draw these indifference curves positively sloped. But the concept is still very, very similar. And when Markowitz developed this idea, he was drawing from microeconomics. Okay. I think we can move on. Okay. So now a little bit more about expected utility theory. So general utility theory is the broadest level of utility theory. It's what we were talking about when we talked about the trade-off between pizza and beer. It's the general theory of trade-offs. Making trade-offs on the basis of a budget constraint and preferences. Okay. And then, of course, as we said in life cycle theories, we're concerned about consumption, and then when we introduce expected utility theory, we're handling uncertainty by handling uncertainty by expressing our preferences as a utility of lotteries, rather than just consumption. Okay, so and as we've mentioned a little bit earlier too, is that really Samuelson and Merton were probably the ones that made the greatest contributions to this area, to applying expected utility theory to life cycle theory, and creating models in which the investor or the consumer simultaneously makes decisions regarding their consumption and their portfolios. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so this is now getting more into the details of von Neumann and Morgenstern's expected utility theory. Basically, what they showed was if you assume these four axioms, completeness and transitivity, and completeness basically means that if you have two lotteries, either prefer one A to B or B to A, or you're different between the two. Transitivity, if you prefer A to B and B to C, you must prefer A to C. And then continuity is a little bit more complicated. It says that if you have you could take two lottery, if you have three ranked lotteries, you can take two of them and combine them to create to get to something that's the same utility as the third, and then there's something called independent. But anyway, the point is that you make these seemingly innocuous assumptions. What von Neumann and Morgenstern proved was that investors' preferences can be expressed with what we call a von Neumann Morgenstern utility function, and this function is a function that is increasing and increases at a decreasing rate. And what it allows us to do is so that instead of having to deal directly with preferences over different lotteries, we really only have to deal with this one utility function. And as I said, it has to be increasing at a decreasing rate, which means it has to be increasing in concave. And it has to be concave because that's what's going to lead to the conclusion that the investor is risk averse. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so this is how you use a utility function to rank alternative. So in this case, we have two possible payouts. A bad outcome that it pays $50, and a good outcome that pays $200. And the average payout is $125. And what this shows is that I would prefer this what's called the certainty equivalent payment of $73.38. This gives me the same I get to the same level of utility as the lottery, and the point is that you prefer certainty to uncertainty. Okay. All right, now we're going to get into some of the math.
Sorry, Paul, we have maybe 5 minutes until the 3 p.m., 4 p.m.
Okay, then I may be concluding on this one then.
Okay.
This is just a mathematical form called constant relative risk aversion, or CRRA. And the reason this is such an important assumption regarding utility theory, a form of the utility function, is that if you have this utility function, then and you're calculating what's the expected utility of holding some portfolio, it doesn't matter what your level of wealth is. You will still rank portfolios the same way, no matter what level of risk you have. And we use the Greek letter theta to represent risk tolerance. So that's how this risk parameter enters into the modeling. And Tao, what do we have now? I guess we just have a few minutes left and see if there's any more questions here. Okay, all right, time to do this one.
I think so.
Okay, let's just do one then. So what Levy and Markowitz showed in their paper in 1979 was that you can approximate the expected utility from a return distribution using mean and variance. Mu is here is mean, sigma squared is variance. You can derive this directly from utility function. Now, this is a very, very powerful finding. I have very rarely seen it done in practice, but when we were creating the models for the book, we did actually implement Levy and Markowitz. So we'll get to that, down the road when we get to part two of the book. But this was the approach we used. We assumed a constant relative risk aversion coefficient, and we used Markowitz to approximate expected utility, and found our optimal portfolios using that method.
And so we have just a
Okay.
couple minutes here. Maybe again, like I say, I'm going to be disciplined about ending right on time. Are there any, again, Paul, you covered a lot of material, I guess. Does anyone have any questions in our closing minutes here related to that?
Just one from me, Tom. There's been some challenges to that axiom of transitivity. There's been some experiments that show that people prefer C over A, or whichever way we turn around. And so is that a challenge to the whole model, or can that just be overcome, do you think?
I would approach that by saying that, and this gets back to the the behavioral economists work, particularly of course Kahneman and Daly. When we go out and we actually perform experiments with people, we find that they do not in reality follow the axioms. They might violate those axioms. But what we're trying to do here, we're not trying to model how people actually behave. We're trying to model how people should behave. And so we think in the model of people should behave, or in other words, as Milton Friedman always talked about, we are not doing positive economics. We're doing normative economics. We think that the von Neumann-Morgenstern theory is in fact a good way of creating models of how people behave, and the output of then is advice to investors. So left to their own devices, investors might behave in ways that violate the axioms, but I think we think that this approach gives advisors a tool for helping them guide their clients into behaving in a more rational fashion.
And so I'm about to conclude, but Dan, imagine that it's 10 years into the future and self-driving cars are a reality, and you could have a self-driving car that's based on an algorithm that perfectly makes decisions exactly how people make decisions, and thus the accident rate of that type of driverless car would perfectly match what actual humans are doing. Or you could have the optimal algorithm that is making decisions in an optimal way, and that driverless car gets you to where you want to get to on time, and it does so at an accident rate that is a fraction of what real world drivers do. Again, I think we would want the driverless car that's based on the optimal algorithm as opposed to how people are actually behaving. So
one thing that I might add, Tom and Paul and Dan, to that point was Markowitz made a distinction between explicit utility maximization, approximate utility maximization, and implicit utility maximization. So one of the things that he pointed out was that if you're going to try to say identify somebody's precise utility function, that exercise in itself is incredibly complicated and probably much more costly and time consuming than you might want to take on. And so what he suggested is that you use an approximation to an expected utility function that is representative of general investor preferences, such as the mean invariance utility function, and that you approximate, you maximize the approximation. Once you have an efficient frontier using that approximation, somebody can choose from that frontier and implicitly maximize their expected utility without necessarily having to detail their utility function, understand utility theory, or any of that kind of stuff. So it just simplifies the process of going throughout. So that I wanted to add that.
Great addition, Ken. And I now have broken my promise and gone a couple minutes over. I'm going to end it here. No worries. We will pick up at this spot. when the recording is ready, I will send out a link to everybody, and I will, in that email, include the reading assignment for next Monday. So thank you all very much. Appreciate you joining us.